Hi, my name's Amanda Hammar, and this is the first of two mini lectures in which I deal with what I call moving methodologies. And these can incorporate or are talked about in terms of go-along methods, walking interviews, walking narratives, and also the idea of walking alone, which is something I'll come back to perhaps more directly in the second lecture. Of course, these can all be combined with many other kinds of methods, both qualitative and quantitative methods, whether that's surveys, quantitative surveys, whether it's interviews with people in different settings, whether you use GIS, whether you use aesthetic methods, as I might call them, photography and video and so on. But whatever one does choose, obviously, it does help that you select methods that are linked in some way to a question or a puzzle that you're trying to investigate. And that's more of the ideal, that you know already what you do want to investigate. But it's fair enough, and it's very common in research that one is quite uncertain about what one really does want to look at and what one's trying to find out. And so sometimes these moving methodologies are useful for helping one discover one's question in situ, literally as you go along. So we'll find out how that might work for us as we proceed. But what this brings up is one of the key paradoxes around research itself, and that paradox is related in a way to the fact that while research is ultimately about knowing or getting to know something, initially it's unavoidably about a relationship to the unknown. And that's where this idea of consciously getting lost and walking along without knowing to begin with necessarily where you're going or what you're discovering. And this is something that's very much raised by people like Walter Benjamin, Michel de Certeau, and more in a more contemporary sense, an American cultural historian and writer called Rebecca Solnit brings this into play. But it is a very old idea. I'll come back to Rebecca Solnit in a moment. But this idea of not knowing what it is one's going to find out about, it's, as shown in the slide here, in the 4th century, we know about Meno, a scholar who's in conversation with Socrates, and asks, how would you go about finding that thing, the nature of which is totally unknown to you? And it's something that a student of mine asked a little while ago as she was embarking on research and not knowing where she was going, or she knew where she was going, but not really quite what she was going to look at. And she asked these similar questions. How do you know about what you don't know? And how do you know what to look for if you don't know what to look for? But what Rebecca Solnit does is she encourages us to face rather than avoid this deep uncertainty. And in a book a 2006 book of hers called A Field Guide to Getting Lost, she talks about this, encouraging us to go into this, and that this yielding to openness and uncertainty is an important act of transformation, both of oneself and in relation to knowledge. So she encourages us, as I say, to accept the unforeseen and the limits to what one can plan and control, to keep our balance, she says, amid surprises, to collaborate with chance. So, drawing on the Walter Benjamin approach of the flaneur, she speaks of consciously losing oneself, as he did in the city. So, where to be lost is to be fully present, and this being present, being fully present, is to be capable of being in uncertainty and discovery. So moving methods to a large extent are less about being in control, less about certainty of the research form, you could say, than more sedentary methods. And I think it's important to compare these just so that we know what the moving methodologies offer us by comparison. So the most classic sedentary methods, which sedentary means, within a fixed location. The most classic would be the sit-down interview, in which talking or narrativity alone is the primary mode of sharing information. And of course, a great deal gets shared, a lot of knowledge is gathered, and data is gathered in these various forms of interview, household surveys, there could be thematic research, with a range of informants. Many different things are spoken about in a sedentary way, so it's not to undermine that, but it is to recognize that there is a certain, as Margareta Kussenbach, who I'll come back to in a moment, talks about, a kind of unnaturalness to a static environment where one is just sitting and having a conversation around a certain topic. As I said, it's not to undermine its value, but it has its limitations. And some of these limitations are related, as Kussenbach again says, to certain kinds of themes that don't lend themselves to narrative accounting. That is, things that an informant might not even think about, might not even consider as significant, but once a body is moving through space, these things might get triggered by memory, by the movement of the body itself. And this is a very phenomenological approach where experience is emphasized, the experience of body and body in relation to place, and in which the movement of living bodies is a key way, as Kussenbach and others argue, to explore how individuals comprehend and engage their physical and social environments in everyday life. And what do we learn from that? What is stimulated and generated through this movement? So what I'm going to do now is just give you a few examples of how these moving methodologies have been applied. And I start with Margareta Kussenbach herself, an urban anthropologist. This is a reference that's given in our syllabus to you. But so she uses what she calls mainly natural go-along methods, and she's used this in a 3-year comparative study in 5 different urban neighborhoods in Los Angeles. These neighborhoods differentiated by class and ethnicity, and this is very much about moving, tagging along with individuals, with different residents, in order to discover how their daily activities and social interactions with their environment relate to their perceptions and understandings of their respective lives, their problems, their dreams. I'm not giving you details of this now, but just to say how these have been used. So another example, 2 British geographers, James Evans and Phil Jones, explore what they call walking interviews, or the walk and talk method. And they do this in a proposed redevelopment site or area of Birmingham in Britain. They're very interested in finding out how the method itself, these walk and talk methods, actually help them assess community attachment to place. And they compare this with more quantitative methods. And one of the key areas of investigation is to find out, is there a relationship between what people say and where they say it? That's one side of their investigation. And on the other hand, what's the difference between qualitative and quantitative data gathering and the data generated through these methods, and which would be familiar to sort of many practiced ethnographers. It's not surprising to claim, or to find out, as they argue and they claim, that in fact where one is speaking, where one is reflecting and observing and then expressing things, of course it does matter where you are. So space and location matters. And on the other hand, they clearly conclude that qualitative methods give very rich data around place and around a sort of a study area that can complement quantitative analyses. So not too surprising, but at least it's one way. So through geographers using it, anthropologists using it. And the third example I'll give is, again, another anthropologist called Doreen Lee, who worked with student activists in Jakarta in Indonesia, using walking narratives to explore what she calls discourses of the street, and through this to see how various people keep alive political histories, both their own histories and the histories of the city itself. So what she does is she goes on these walking narratives with them, and together they retrace the subjective on-site experiences and the emotional afterlives of 2 key political demonstrations that took place in the late 1990s in Jakarta that turned violent and tragic. And for some of these student activists, there's the experience of being survivors while others were not. And she picks up on what Michel de Certeau talks of as walking as memory work, and seeing these as narrative acts of memorialization. So it's an important method that brings things to the surface that may not be visible. And that has a relationship to how I myself got exposed to walking narratives and the value of those walking narratives that was sometime in the late 1990s. This was not an urban research, it was actually rural. In a rural setting for me, I was looking at small-scale farmers in Zimbabwe, rural Zimbabwe, who had been violently evicted by the local authority and who had managed to go back to where they'd been evicted from, where some of their homes and their full granaries had been burned down. And they, I'm just going to read a little bit from one of my chapters in my PhD called The Day of Burning, where I refer to how evictees asked me, in the course of talking about what was around them, they asked me to accompany them. And as I say, their narratives in a sedentary sit-down interview were often interrupted by an invitation for me to come and view the evidence of destruction. Together, we would walk around the dusty yard, scrawny chickens and lean dogs underfoot, and someone would point to the site where a particular sleeping hut or grain store had once stood, the foundations peering out of the dry earth like an accusation. The charcoaled edges of burnt construction poles, of shattered clay storage pots and broken farm implements still littered corners of the yard. Occasionally, these assertions of suffering and injustice would become even more dramatic. Once several plastic sacks were dragged out into the open from a nearby hut, and their contents emptied onto mats where the charred relics of a past life were displayed with archival precision. Fragments of clothing, kitchen utensils, even full maize cobs, all blackened by fire and underscored by the pungent smell of smoke. So my point is that only by being walked through the space of this destruction and witnessing the embodied memory of place did the extent of the emotional and structural depths of the eviction reveal themselves to me. So I'd like to just say here that, to conclude, this was one way of giving a sense of what moving methodologies offer us, and I will in the accompanying lecture say a little bit more about the practicalities of undertaking these methodologies.